The problem with preaching the gospel is that it tends to attract people. Now, at first glance, you're probably thinking, what are you talking about? That's a wonderful thing. We want as many people to get saved as we can. And you're absolutely right. The issue is, what do you do with them after that? You see, when I was in my 20s, I thought the problem was the church had lost its way. We'd reduced everything down to a 30-minute pep talk, a nice little concert. Everybody gets some donuts, they all go home, and nothing changes. And so in my mind, I thought maybe we just need to go smaller. We need to do a house church again. But here's the thing, I've done house church. And here's what happens when you do house church: the gospel attracts people. And the more it attracts people, the more powerful the gospel is when you shrink it down and you start getting into people's real lives. That real power, that real change attracts more people. And necessarily, as more people come, then you run into the problem of scale. And I'm going to tell you the thing that prevents these things from growing successfully and why they end up becoming completely programatized. It's because the growth of an organization is going to be on the back of one of two things. It's either going to be on the back of leadership or processes. It's always one of the two, because you cannot scale up massive groups of people who all want to participate in something if you don't have either enough leaders to be able to have one person per 12 to 25 people who's a strong enough leader to be able to be directly connected with these people's lives and navigate the messiness of walking people through salvation. You either have to have enough leaders to do a 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 model, or you have to have really strong processes and programs where you can put people into an environment where the leader doesn't have to be strong enough to manage all of those people, but they can lean a little bit on the program to handle some of the weight. And so when God starts moving in an environment, when the Spirit of God lands and people's lives start being transformed and they sense the presence of power of God in a place, they're drawn to that light. But then, depending on how many come in and how quickly, these are the problems that you immediately face. You either have to programatize, or you have to have extremely strong and a deep bench of leaders. And most places are not able to develop leaders that quickly. And so they end up leaning on programs. But programs oftentimes can become a crutch. And so what I think happens a lot of times with these large organizations is they programatize, and the ease of programming becomes the focal point, because you can scale programming much faster than you can scale leadership. And so they just continue to scale and scale and scale instead of actually stopping to consider, are we really engaged in these people's lives at the level that we need to be for real transformation? Or are we just sort of scaling to meet the interest? And I think that's where things start to break down. I think that's where a lot of these mega churches have gotten off track. And again, I'm not saying all of them, right? Because define a mega church. I've listened to a podcast with Carl Lentz and Ruslan KD, and I thought they had a really good, honest conversation about these challenges. How do you define a mega church? Is it over 2,000? Is it over 10,000, right? But the reality is that anything over a couple hundred, you start running into these challenges of scale. If you think about it in terms of Jesus's ministry, Jesus was a 1 to 12, and he was Jesus, right? One person to 12 people for real, like in-depth life on life discipleship. So if you just kind of take out the fact that he's God and we put like a normal human in that position, maybe you reduce it down to a 1 to 10. That means that you need 10 strong leaders per 100 people in your organization. I want you to stop and process that. 10 strong leaders per 100 people in the organization. Most organizations that have 100 people, they have one leader strong enough to deal with 10 people. And that one leader is usually the pastor of that organization. You go to 1,000, that means that you now need to have 100 strong leaders to be able to scale successfully without programs. Okay. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that programs are bad or there's anything wrong with programs, right? I think there's a place for that. because there's a reality to the fact that part of what we do as Christians is raising young believers. That's a relational process that requires a person who functions as a sort of spiritual father or spiritual mother in that person's life. But there's a secondary part of it, which is teaching and training, because we have access to such a greater amount of information right now than we did, say, even 500 years ago. But if you go all the way back to the early church didn't even have the New Testament. They only had, well, really, most of them didn't even have the Old Testament, right? They actually had bits and pieces, fragments of the Old Testament, but most of it was just what was orally passed down by the apostles. So we're living in a very interesting time right now where we actually have access to a more complete version of Scripture than any other church in human history. And so, for the first time, really, in the church's history, the necessity to have a deeper understanding of Scripture, of historical culture, of context, right? There is a need to have a greater level of education about the realities of Scripture and about the history behind the formation of the Bible and all of these different things. There is a greater need for that now than there really ever has been in human history, simply because the vast majority of people 500 years ago were not encountering the volume of information about the Bible, and particularly the volume of misinformation about the Bible that they would have encountered, I mean, even up to 100 years ago in reality. And so, for those types of things, having programs and training and teaching that is focused on very specific aspects of what we do is more necessary now than it might have been, say, 100 years ago. And so, I think there is very much room for programs, right? And also the fact that there's social complexity that we're dealing with now, with people coming out of all manner of lifestyles that they need to walk through the process of coming out of that lifestyle specifically. And there's large groups of people who are all trying to come out of very specific lifestyles, where having someone who understands that lifestyle, understand what it's like trying to come out of it, and being able to hyper focus on that particular group of people to help coach and train them and walk them through that process in a way that is unique from the general discipleship and raising up of a believer. These types of things I think are really good. And I think these large institutions that we have formed, for all of their flaws, I think there is a real opportunity for these organizations to be very powerful in providing these things. I just think the issue is they have lost the plot, and they've unfortunately gotten kind of sucked into the business of church in a lot of ways, and not in all ways. And I'm not saying all churches, okay? Just acknowledging kind of the general feel, I think, in Christian culture is that a lot of these large institutions have sort of lost the plot. And I think we just need to recognize that the priority's been lost, and we need to get back on track with what the priority is.